Joshua chapter number 2 tonight. I want to begin reading in verse number 1 about a Bible character that may be known to some and unknown to others. Joshua chapter 2 and verse number 1, And Joshua the son of Nun sent out of Shittim 2 men to spy secretly, saying, Go view the land, even Jericho. And they went and came into an harlot's house named Rahab and lodged there. And it was told the king of Jericho, saying, Behold, there came men in hither tonight of the children of Israel to search out the country. And the king of Jericho sent unto Rahab, saying, Bring forth the men that are come to thee, which are entered into thine house, for they be come to search out all the country. And the women took the 2 men and hid them, and said thus, There came men unto me, but I wist not whence they were. And it came to pass about the time of the shutting of the gate, when it was dark, that the men went out. Whither the men went, I wot not. Pursue after them quickly, for ye shall overtake them. But she had brought them up to the roof of the house, and hid them with the stalks of flax, which she had laid in order upon the roof. And the men pursued after them the way to Jordan under the fords. And as soon as they which pursued after them were gone out, they shut the gate. And before they were laid down, she came up unto them upon the roof, and she said unto the men, I know that the Lord hath given you the land, and that your terror is fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land faint because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you, and when you came up out of Egypt, what you did unto the 2 kings of the Amorites that were on the other side Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom ye utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts did melt, neither did there remain any more courage in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and earth beneath. Now therefore I pray you, swear unto me by the Lord, since I have showed you kindness, that ye will show kindness unto my father's house, and give me a true token that ye will save alive my father and my mother and my brethren, and my sisters, and all that they have, and deliver our lives from death. And the men answered her, Our life for yours. If ye utter not this our business, and it shall be, when the Lord hath given us the land, that we will deal kindly and truly with thee. And in those 14 verses, we see an introduction to a rather obscure Old Testament character named Rahab. When I think of Rahab and I think of her journey, I liken it to this phrase that you have heard on many occasions, from rags to riches. Have you ever heard that terminology before? Years ago, I was reading in the Charlotte Observer, and it was highlighting a couple in Rock Hill, in North Carolina, that crossed the border and played the South Carolina Education Lottery. Now, let me make it very plain tonight. I'm not advocating the lottery. If you want to play the lottery, that's the equivalent of just throwing your money into a fire. It's the equivalent of contributing to more poverty in this state. I was so disgusted when years ago North Carolina followed suit in South Carolina, and they instituted the North Carolina Education Lottery. And what really perturbed me is that the more conservative political party was the backbone behind ushering it into our state, and it just burned me up. And so I'm not a proponent of the lottery. Understand, it's a tax on the poor. It's poor stewardship. But nonetheless, this couple played the lottery, and lo and behold, they won. This was years ago, $60 million in the lottery, and the Charlotte Observer lifted them up as a textbook couple that went from rags to riches overnight. I mean, they went from relative obscurity to now everybody is their cousin and uncle coming out of the woodworks saying, give me a piece of the pie. I don't know if you saw in the news recently, but there was a man from West Virginia who won the lottery years ago, and it ruined his life. He would tell you it did. All of the riches he squandered, and it brought him great sorrow, and he died doubtless a premature death. But many times when you think of money, you think, boy, here's somebody who's gone from rags to riches. I mean, they've gone from poverty, and here they've been elevated to great status. But tonight I want to invite you, when you think of the life of Rahab, listen to me. What God did for Rahab is far better than what the lottery did for that couple in North Carolina. This couple in North Carolina, they may have gained physical riches that will one day burn up when this globe burns up in a ball. But do you understand what God did for Rahab? He truly took her from rags to riches. He took her from the filth of sin and eventually would elevate her into the genealogy of none other than Jesus Christ Himself. I want to tell you tonight, if anybody can help you and anybody can make a difference in your life, it's God. God can take a life that is shattered and take a life that is broken and in His own way take it and use it in an amazing way. And for every Christian here tonight, there is something to learn from the life of Rahab. If you've been raised in a pastor's home and you never have one time set your foot in a place that is considered a sinful place, you can thank God tonight that when you were a child, you were saved and God elevated you from rags to riches and now you're a child of the King. But you know what? You might be a person here tonight. You say, Brother Beal, I wasted several years of my life. And I went and the devil reminds me every day of the things that I have done. I want to invite you for the next few minutes to quit thinking about what the devil reminds you of and see what God did for Rahab and know that God can do it for you. So as we study the life of Rahab tonight, I want to do a survey of her life. I want to take a few moments to teach you lessons about the life of Rahab the harlot. Number one, I want you to see her conversion. One thing is very clear in the Bible. The fact is that here was a lady who placed her faith in Jehovah God in the Old Testament. There's no doubt about it. The Bible tells us in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 31, by faith the harlot Rahab perished not with them that believed not when she had received the spies with peace. Now, because we commonly know Rahab as Rahab the harlot, because that tag is listed beside of her name on at least 2 occasions in the Bible, when we hear that, sometimes it's hard for us to process and we say, boy, was that lady really saved? I'm going to tell you something. A lot of times you're thinking about her past and you don't pay attention to what she did with God. But in Joshua chapter 2, I believe we have witnessed the moment in which Rahab places her faith in God. When she makes the grand confession at the end of verse 11, she said, for the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and in earth beneath. At that moment, listen, she's beginning to change her mind. She acknowledges that God, Jehovah, is the Lord, and she is about to enter into learning a whole new phase of things. Why? Because she's opened her heart up in belief. But the greatest thing that ever happened to Rahab, you understand, was the day that she placed her faith in Jehovah God. You say, well, I still don't think that she was saved. Well, at least admit then, according to your own thinking, she's the only unsaved person mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11. James chapter 2 and verse 25, likewise also was not Rahab the harlot justified by works when she had received the messengers and had sent them out another way? Now the book of James is a very controversial book in some spheres. You take this verse for face value and you say, well, my soul, she was justified by works when she had received the messengers. But you have to consider the whole theme of James. When the Bible says faith without works is dead, James does not teach a salvation by works, but it does teach a salvation that works, and there's a difference. I think at the very moment that you see her hiding these spies, it's giving evidence of the faith that she has placed in God. But I want to ask you tonight, you may not have been in the dregs and the muck and the mire of sin. But my friend, if you don't know the Lord tonight, listen, you're far worse off than Rahab was. Rahab came to a breaking point in her life, but you know it's interesting, Jesus, you find in His ministry, Jesus spoke the harshest to religious lost people. He could talk of the love of God to the sinner. He could display compassion to a sinner who was a publican or somebody who was an outcast, and they would come to Him, but the religious crowd was so hard. And I want you to think about this, what Jesus told the religious crowd in Matthew 21, verse 31. He said, whether of them twain did the will of their father. They say unto him, the first. Now Jesus saith unto them, now here it is, listen to this. Jesus saith unto them, verily I say unto you that the publicans and the harlots go into the kingdom of God before you. Now that's pretty stout. But Jesus said that to the religious crowd because the publicans and the harlots knew that they were sinners. Let me tell you, the people that have a hard time acknowledging that they're sinners, that's Bible college students and people raised sometimes in Christianity. And while you've been taught the truth about the gospel, you've just simply placed your faith, your confidence in the fact that you were raised in a Christian home, as Brother Duke acknowledged last week. I want to beg all of you, listen, you make sure that this first step that took place in the life of Rahab has taken place in your own. You see, first of all, her conversion. Number two, I want you to see her challenge. I want to propose to you tonight that the life of Rahab was a challenge to every person on the face of planet Earth in her day. What would you do if on Monday I came into chapel and I said, now listen, on Thursday night I'm going to preach on a Bible character that's going to challenge your shoes off? Well, you'd probably look at your friends afterwards and somebody'd say, I'll bet you he's going to preach on David. I mean, he was a man after God's own heart. Somebody else said, no, I think it was on Noah. I mean, he built the ark. Somebody said, oh, would you hush, it's Moses. We all know that because there's not a man so meek in all the earth as Moses. Somebody else pipe up and say, no, it's John the Baptist. Jesus said he was a good man. But I'll guarantee you one thing, there's not a person in this room that would have looked at their peer and said, I know he's going to preach on Rahab, the harlot. I mean, just by default. But I want to provoke you to thought about the challenge of her life tonight. Do you know that her life was a challenge to every Israelite in Israel during that day? And here is how her life was a challenge to every Israelite. Rahab was raised in a pagan city. Jericho did not have a First Baptist church. Jericho, they had very little Bible knowledge. Do you know that? They did not have the luxuries that you and I have. We hear that even in the Bible Belt, there are even lost people that have heard Bible stories. She was raised in a pagan society and she had very little light. Now what little she had, you find in verse number 10. Notice this. She says, for we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you. Now when you hear that, she at this point, somehow she got it. I don't know if it was the Jericho Times. I don't know where she got it. But word travels, just like in Bible college, word travels, doesn't it? Word travels, and she hears that the Red Sea is dried up. Now, at this point in her experience as a believer, she has more sense than a lot of liberal theologians. Because here she takes it at face value. He dried up the Red Sea. He didn't make it murky. He didn't lead them through knee-deep water. No, He dried up the Red Sea, and she admits it. Liberal churches don't today. And they say, well, actually what happened is Israel, they went across and they went through knee-deep water, and that's how they got, God made a way that way. Listen to me. Those liberals have created a far greater problem when they explain away the miracles of the Bible, because now they no longer have to explain how 2 million people went across the Red Sea. Now they have to explain how Pharaoh's entire army drowned in knee-deep water. You know what? This woman did not have a lot. She didn't have college chapels. She didn't have a Baptist church. She had very little. She heard about how Israel had whipped Sihon and Og, whom ye utterly destroyed. It was a KO. But let me tell you something. Rahab didn't have a lot, but look at me and listen. She did a lot with the little that she had. Now let me tell you how this woman's a rebuke to every one of us. I'm talking to some of you, listen, you've had so much Bible compared to what other people in the world have, but right now in your heart you're doing very little with it. Oh, you're putting it in your head and you're preparing for a test, but you've not let the Word of God transform you and change you. You see, Rahab, she did a lot with what little she had. And I want to ask you, have you come to the point where you've become so hardened, you've heard it? I'll tell you, one of the things that breaks my heart is when you talk to a teenager and they're like, yeah, I've heard that, I've heard that, I've heard that. That's a very dangerous place to be. As a matter of fact, I think it's almost as dangerous as somebody who's maybe just a flat-out skeptic. Why? Because you have become so familiar with the truth that you don't even realize what you have. And one of my fears in this environment is you will get it in the classroom, you will get it in the chapel, but yet it means nothing to you. Her life was a challenge to every Israelite. I want to say, if you're here tonight and you've taken the Bible and you've pushed it aside, you have 66 books. She had a snippet, but she embraced it, and God changed her life. Imagine what happened to you if you took 66 books and you embraced it like she did what little she had. But you know what? Her life was also not only a challenge to every Israelite, her life was a challenge to every Canaanite. Everybody in Jericho, they all heard the same thing. I think a lot of people in Jericho heard about Sihon and Og. They heard about the Red Sea, but here's the problem. The vast majority of Jericho, they perished in judgment. Heard the same thing. You know, often when I'm preaching, I can be preaching a message and see two totally different reactions. I can preach a message in this chapel service and see somebody who's on the edge of their seat. And man, they're with you. I mean, just eating out of your hand. And I can look on the other side or another section of the auditorium and I see that look. You say, what does that look like? I almost don't want to tell you. It's that look of just, it's that look, if they showed up their wedding like that, their wife-to-be would smack their heads off. It's just numb. I'm here. Get this over with. Two totally different reactions to the same message. You have one lady who puts her faith in Jehovah after all that she's heard, and everybody else, you know what? They perished because the Bible says they believed not. Every Canaanite that perished when the walls of Jericho fell, listen to me, they heard the same exact thing that Rahab did. You know what saved her neck and killed them? It's what you do with the truth. And every day that you come to chapel, you have a dilemma. Every day that you hear preaching, the question is what will you do with the truth? Because it'll make you or it'll break you. Number one, her conversion. Number two, her challenge. Number three, I want you to see Rahab's courage. Here we enter into quite a controversial part of her life. You remember they come to her and they said, where are these spies? And she's like, what are you talking about? And some of you are like, I have found a proof text for lying right here. You know, some people are like, well, she misled those people. Now, I've heard a lot of theories and such. People say, well, in the time of war, deception is acceptable, or they say it was okay for her to lie in this situation. Listen, I'm not here to solve that moral dilemma tonight. You talk to me about it later, and I will tell you this. But here's one thing that I can tell you about this instance. When she hid those spies, I can dogmatically, definitively say that the Bible always uplifts and honors Rahab's faith in the matter. I don't go to the book of Hebrews and says, thou shalt lie, but it does say a lot about Rahab's faith, and I think you do well to focus on that than all of the other controversy. Here's basically what this woman did. You know what this woman did? In a pagan land where the king, could you imagine the FBI or somebody knocking on your door, a U.S. Marshal, and I mean, they're like, where are they at? I mean, this is the equivalent of it. You know what this woman did? She put her life on the line. Do you understand that she risked her life to accept these men and to respond to their message and one day leave. It was no small sacrifice. And would to God that every one of us in this room and all that are under the sound of my voice tonight, that we too would have the same courage as Rahab. You say, I don't think I can learn much from her. Listen, if you can go out and you're just fearful about the gospel, and at your workplace you're not willing to take a stand, you'd do well to learn from Rahab. It was not a convenient or popular thing to be in her position at her time. They didn't have Christians Anonymous that gathered together every Thursday night and said, all right, let's talk. She had no support group whatsoever. She was it. Some of you are like, oh, I just don't know if I can make it in this world and do it. Listen to me, if Rahab could put her neck on the line in Jericho, I know you can do it in North Carolina. She had courage. You know why? Because in her heart she had a conviction. And there may be some of you here tonight. You know what you need to find in your heart? You need to find a little conviction. Are you going to believe anything fervently? Does God really mean anything to you? Is Jesus really special to you? Then have some conviction in your heart and be unashamed and be willing to put your life on the line. The woman had such courage. She didn't spare those spies out of expediency or convenience or pity. It was her faith that motivated her to risk her life. Now let me ask you a question. What does your faith motivate you to do? Can it even motivate you out the door to share the gospel? Can it motivate you to take a stand at work? Hey, what does your faith motivate you to do? You see her courage. But let's continue on. I want you to see, next of all, I want you to see her concern. Somehow, some way, Rahab knew that judgment was coming. You say, how do you know that? Well, a little reasoning. Take logic class, you'll start learning. Put two and two together. She goes to those spies after she talks to them. She says, listen, I just have one thing I'd like to say, that you'd save my family. She knew some way that judgment was coming. And here was a woman who was very early in her faith. And do you know who was on her mind? Her family. Rahab didn't say, now listen, I've got a 401k in that bank over there. I'll lose it all when you guys come, so I need a little advance notice so I can get it out. See, all this stuff that I bought, I've got a chariot down there that I'm still making payments on. No, it wasn't about things. You know what it was about? It was about people. I marvel when I think about the concern that this lady had for her family members at such an early stage in her faith. Young people, when's the last time you've thought about a family member and the judgment of God? Was your summer so filled with activity and so much about yourself that you forgot about everybody else? Let me tell you, your family ought to be dear to your heart, just like Rahab's was dear to her. I was doing a little studying this summer for an article that I wrote about Mormon missionaries. It's incredible how many Mormon missionaries are sent out across the world every year. And did you know that most of those Mormon missionaries will pay like $400 a month or something out of their own pocket to fund their 2-year missions trips? Did you know that? Now, I know they may be thinking that's getting them to heaven, but there's still something to be said about that. Mormon missionaries will pay hundreds of dollars out of their pockets every month to go around this world and to spread a false gospel. I remember years ago, my wife and I, we were in a meeting. The meeting was in Alliance, North Carolina, but I was staying in a prophet's chamber in New Bern. And I distinctly remember that prophet's chamber because there was a dead bird in the fireplace that we had to get out. But another thing that was interesting about that week is while we were there were 2 guys that were in white shirts, black pants, and bicycles. And they were making their way down the street. My wife said, "Oh, honey, look, there's Mormons." I said, "I know." And sure enough, they came to our door, and my wife said, "Now, honey, please be civil." She wasn't asking me to bid them Godspeed. She just knows that it's just like it rises when I talk with them. And so the two came out on the front porch, and I still remember, listen, when you deal with people from a cult, listen, when you see a couple, usually you're going to see one who's like the trainer. He knows it all. And then you're going to see the other one, and he's like the trainee. He's just learning. All right, this is just my own philosophy, but I've made up my mind. When I encounter the two, I'm going to find out who the teacher is, and after a while, put my hand in his face and talk to the trainee. And so he began to tell me all these things about Joseph Smith and such. And finally, I looked at him and I said, "Now listen," I said, I didn't tell them who I was, what I'd done, if I was a preacher or what a Christian. I'm not even a Christian. I said, "Sir," I said, "man, you've been doing all the talking. This guy hasn't done any." I said, "Do you mind if I ask him some questions?" He said, "Oh, no, go right ahead." And so I did. And after about 2 minutes of that, where he's stuttering, the trainer said, "Oh, it's time to go." And I said, "Well, wait a second, I'm not finished." He said, "It's time to go." And they left. And you know, a lot of times people make fun of Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. But here's a sad reality. And I know that they're probably doing it because they're trying to work their way to God and to heaven, and it's a false gospel. But it's a shame that a lost and dying world would think those people are more committed and more concerned than the average independent Baptist. I remember going to a house in Shelby, and a man was a Jehovah's Witness, and I knocked on his door. He said, "Oh, you're Baptist." He said, "I can't believe you're out." And he just sort of just took that knife and jabbed it in a little bit. You know, the shame is that the cults of our world show more concern than a lot of people with the truth. And you know what? It's hard to ask you to go out and reach Joe Blow out on the street that you've never met before if you could care less about whether or not your family's in heaven or hell. You know what I'm saying tonight? I'm saying this. Rahab had a greater concern for her family at a young stage of her faith than many people who've been saved for years today have for theirs. When's the last time you've just let a little concern hit your heart? She said, "Oh, that you would save alive my father and my mother and my brethren and all that they have." That's who was on her heart. Who's been on yours? Not only do you see her concern, but next of all, I want you to see her curse. You say, what's Rahab's curse? The curse is this. When you see her name referenced in the New Testament, you sometimes find these two words, Rahab the harlot. I find it interesting that those two words are attached to her name in Hebrews chapter 11. It's almost like a blot. But can I just give you my opinion this evening? It's just my opinion, but I believe that God left those two words beside of her name in Hebrews chapter 11 not to kick her or not to stomp down on her, but to remind people in this room tonight the things you do early on in your life can scar you the rest of your life. You know, one night of fun can make for months of weeping. And that's Bible, because there is pleasure in sin for a season. I'm sure Rahab would say, boy, if there's anything that I could have erased out of my life, it would have been those two words. But she was defined by that. Not just in the book of Hebrews do we see that, but many times today, if I mentioned the word Rahab in a Bible college environment, it wouldn't be, that's the woman that said that the Red Sea dried up, and she said that God beat Sihon and Og, and she placed her. No. Well, that's not where we would have gone. Let's be honest. We would have said, yeah, Rahab, the harlot, the immoral woman. I don't think God left that attached to her name to beat her down, but I think God left it there to get our attention. Listen to me. You make a great major mistake in youth, and it can define you, or you can be known for it the rest of your life, whether you like it or not. If you go into my office, you'll see that I have some favorite sports teams, and you're going to see up on one of the walls, you're going to see a baseball scene where there's a man who is running to first base, and there's a ball that's going out to the outfield. It was Game 6 of the 1986 World Series. I'm a New York Mets fan. For you Braves fans, I apologize, but the Braves stunk in the 80s, and it was hard to like them when they smelled so bad, all right, so badly. So I didn't get attached to them, but I did pull for them to win the World Series this last year because I really enjoyed their stand on some things, and even if they were in my division, I didn't care. I wanted them to win, so I'm not one of these. It's just all sour grapes. But if you looked at that picture, you would find two key characters. You would find one guy named Mookie Wilson. You would find another guy, his name Bill Buckner. Mookie Wilson was an outfielder for the New York Mets who would hit a ball and put it into play. And in a very crucial part of the bottom of in the last part of that game, that slow dribbler went between the legs of Bill Buckner, who was Boston's first baseman, went out into the outfield, and before it was over with, the winning run would score, and the New York Mets would win Game 6. Had they lost that game, the Red Sox would have won the World Series. The Red Sox were 1 out away from breaking the curse. The Mets came back in Game 7, and they won Game 7, and they won the World Series. I have to be careful. Mrs. Bailiff's mourning. She's a Red Sox fan. That's why she doesn't come in my office, or she just goes like this. But can I tell you something in fairness about Bill Buckner? He was a great baseball player. When that happened, do you know that Bill Buckner got death threats? He died in his late 60s. The man even relocated to the state of Idaho to just get away from... people would talk so cruelly about this man who in his prime was probably one of the best, one of the top in the league. And you mention the name Bill Buckner today, and many people, that's all they talk about. It's not that he ever won an award for a Gold Glove, or it's not that he ever had a decent batting average. They say, yeah, that's the guy who blew it. That's what he's known for today. I've heard so many Bill Buckner jokes from people where, that's what they joke about it. And can I tell you, even as a New York Mets fan, that's so unfair. Because there was so much more to the man than one mistake. But I'm going to tell you, just like the world remembers Bill Buckner, I'll tell you, the devil wants to hone down on an Ambassador Baptist College student. You ruin your life, and he'll try to remind you of it every day, and he'll have a lost world tell you about it. I may be talking to somebody here this evening. Listen, you're on the threshold of just doing something, pardon the language, but you're on the threshold of just doing something stupid. Maybe your flesh has just controlled you in such a way that it is driving you into a bad situation. And if you take another step, listen, one day you're going to reap what you can ever have to erase it from the minds of men. I'm not here to tell you can't get forgiveness from God. I'm here to tell you men are a lot less forgiving than God is. And you'll have to live with it. But the last thing that I want you to see tonight is I want you to see her crown. Turn with me to Matthew chapter 1 as we close. Her crown. Now, before I start this final part of the message, I want to say there may be some individuals in here, you say, Preacher, I have made some bad mistakes that I cannot erase. And maybe you'd say, I'm even known by those mistakes in my youth group, or I'm known by those mistakes in my neighborhood. Listen, if that's you, I want to encourage you. Would you listen to the end of the story? I've not tried to cast down on you in the last few minutes and say your life is forever wrecked, because you need to see what God did for Rahab. Now we're about to read a very exciting chapter of the Bible. It's a genealogy. I know that's the one that people just say, oh, let's read a genealogy. You'll learn the word begat a lot before it's over with. But in Matthew chapter 1, verse number 5, and Salmon begat Boaz of Rahab. You're like, big deal. Mother, father, child, family tree. You want to know what the big deal is? I'm going to tell you what the big deal is. When Rahab, who has lived her life as an immoral person, she's been given to immorality, she's known as a harlot, finally places her faith in Jehovah God. Do you know what happens? All of a sudden now, after Joshua 6, she's introduced to the entire nation of Israel. And one of those Israelite men, he's looking around, and all of a sudden he stops and says, who is that? Oh, you don't want her. That's that woman that came from Jericho. Oh, just hush. Where does she live? And before it's over with, listen, do you see what happened? God took a lady who was just a token, a woman who was a token of men's affections, and sold herself with no value, and all of a sudden, you know what God does? God blesses her with a husband and a home. I think that's awesome. I know in our mindsets we talk about getting things right the first time, and that's what we want you to do. But you know what's wonderful is when you see that when people make mistakes, instead of kicking them to the curb, you know what God did? God said, I'll tell you what, Rahab, you're making some steps in the right direction. I'm going to give you a husband, and I'm going to one-up it. I'm going to give you a baby boy. We could stop there and say, man, that was great. This woman was wrecking her life, and God now gives her stability, and God gives her true love, and now God's given her a baby boy that's going to keep her up all night. But it only gets better. Because God not only gives her a husband and a child, God gives her a grandchild. And Boaz begat Obed of Ruth. Now her son gets married, and it's interesting, his wife, similar predicament to Rahab. And now she has a grandchild. I had something happen the other day. I mentioned it to my wife, and I think to the Schmitz when we were out. The other day, somebody came up to me and they said, do you have any grandchildren? And when they said that, there was a part of me that just was like, oh. Not that I don't want grandchildren, but I'm not supposed to be old enough to have grandchildren. So reality has finally settled in. But God gave her a grandchild. I talked to grandparents. It used to be years ago, grandparents would take out these humongous photo albums, and they would wring it down all the way to the floor and say, let me show you my grandchildren. And for the next 2 hours, you're a captive audience. That's totally changed. Now it's with an iPhone. They're like, oh, let me show you these pictures. It'll only take us an hour to go through these. Do you understand what God is doing for this woman? This is a woman that trashed her life. And if she stood before us tonight, she'd tell everyone here, don't you make the same mistakes that I did. I would have found God a lot earlier. Don't you live loose with your body. Don't you just treat the whims of your flesh like you want. Listen, she would tell you, get saved, live for God from day one. But I'm going to tell you what happened. Here this woman, she makes these mistakes. She gets saved. God gives her a husband. God gives her a son. And now God gives her a grandchild. I'm going to spare you the long line. But it's not too far after that. Do you know what the greatest king that Israel has ever known? Guess who his great-great-great-grandmother was? 2 or 3 greats. Rahab. You ever hear grandparents brag on their children? I don't think that she was alive when David was born, but had she been, and David had just been coronated king, maybe she was 130 years old, she'd said, I'll tell you what, I got a I don't know how many great-grandsons, but he's a keeper. You know what God did? God took somebody that the world said was unworthy and useless. Do you understand? And put her in the lineage of King David. But it only gets a lot better many years down the road. Because you get to the end of Matthew chapter 1, you find there's nobody any greater than Jesus. Do you know what that's a great illustration of? That's a great illustration of God's grace. There may be some of you here tonight and you say, man, I'll tell you what, I have made mistakes and they beat me up so much. I'm not here to tell you your mistakes were right. I'm not here to tell you that your foolishness was a great thing. But I'm telling you, I'm here to tell you that the grace of God, when you surrender and you walk in faith, listen, God's grace can do some amazing things. And don't let the devil remind you over and over and over again. Think forward to what God has given you and embrace it and follow Him. And I promise you, God will do the same thing for you that He did for Rahab many years ago. But we've come to the end of this message. We see how that God can take a person from rags to riches, and I trust that you've experienced that in your own life, but I believe there's some of you tonight that need to rise up in courage like Rahab. There are others of you, you need to have a concern for your family members. You've been saved for years, and you've hardly remembered them in prayer. You've hardly asked God for their souls, and here this woman is newly saved. Maybe some of you tonight, you're on the verge of making a horrible mistake. You better remember the curse of Rahab. Maybe some of you tonight just need to be given a glimmer of hope that God is able to use